Hi, I'm Lauren Brooks, and a visit to my uncle's lawyer turned strange the moment I walked through the door. He burst out laughing, announcing I wasn't getting a single thing from the will. My stomach dropped, but I kept quiet, watching everyone exchange awkward looks. Then the attorney reached for a sealed envelope with my name on it. The air tightened instantly, and whatever was inside changed the entire room before I even opened it. The law office smelled like old paper and furniture polish, the kind of scent that makes you sit up straighter without meaning to. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing the only black dress I owned. My grandmother had passed 3 weeks ago, and I still wasn't sure why I'd been summoned. We weren't estranged, but we weren't close either, not in the way that usually earns you a seat at these readings. Yet here I was, about to find out why she remembered me at all. My Uncle Richard was already seated when I walked in, scrolling through his phone like this was just another appointment. He barely glanced up, offering nothing but a quick nod. The attorney, Mr. Harrison, gestured for me to sit across from my uncle. Before I could settle in, Richard looked at me with a half-smile and said I shouldn't get too comfortable. He said it like a joke, but something underneath made my cheeks flush. I had no expectations, yet his comment made me feel like a trespasser. Mr. Harrison began reading preliminary clauses, his voice measured and professional. When he reached property distribution, Richard sat forward, a kind of hunger sharpening his expression. The house, the savings account, the jewelry, every single item went to my uncle. I watched his shoulders relax with each announcement, satisfaction spreading across his face. The silence around my name felt heavier than anticipated. Then, Richard let out a careless laugh and said Grandma always knew who actually showed up for holidays. The dig landed harder than he intended. I had missed a few years, yes, but not because I didn't care. Life had pulled me in difficult directions I never found a way to explain. Mr. Harrison paused, his pen hovering above the paperwork. Then he reached into his drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope, slightly yellowed, with my name written across the front in my grandmother's handwriting. The air shifted immediately. Richard's laughter faded into something uncertain. The envelope sat on the desk like a question no one wanted to ask. Mr. Harrison explained that my grandmother had left specific instructions for this to be delivered separately, outside the formal will. Richard demanded to know what that meant, his voice edged with impatience. The lawyer simply slid the envelope toward me. I noticed my hands trembling as I reached for it, my grandmother's slow, careful script staring back at me, the same handwriting from birthday cards I'd saved as a child. I didn't open it right away. Inside was a single folded letter and a small brass key. The key meant nothing yet, but the letter, I recognized the cream-colored paper with tiny flowers along the border. She started with my childhood nickname, one I hadn't heard in over a decade. That alone made my eyes sting. She wrote that she knew I'd wonder why I wasn't included in the main reading, and she wanted to explain herself in her own words. Grandma wrote about the summers I spent at her house when I was young, back when my parents were struggling and needed somewhere safe to send me. She said those months meant more to her than I probably realized. Reading her words brought it rushing back. The bread baking lessons, the porch stories at night. She explained that the key belonged to a storage unit across town, kept secret from the family, containing things she wanted only me to have because they carried meaning she didn't trust anyone else to understand. I looked up from the letter, and Richard was staring with suspicion and frustration. He demanded to know what it said. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back without answering. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor, accusing me of hiding something. He said Grandma must have lost her mind near the end. The words hit me like a slap, but I didn't flinch. Something unexpected rose inside me, not anger, but quiet certainty about who she truly was. Mr. Harrison intervened, reminding Richard the will was executed properly, and the envelope was a separate, personal matter. My uncle stormed out, muttering about contesting everything. The lawyer assured me quietly there was nothing to contest. The letter and key were gifts, not legal assets. I stepped into the afternoon sunlight feeling lighter and heavier at once, carrying something precious I hadn't earned, but somehow had always been meant to receive. I drove across town to the storage facility that afternoon. the brass key warm in my palm. The place was ordinary. Rows of metal doors under a gray corrugated. Standing in front of the unit, I hesitated. Whatever was inside had been kept secret for a reason. The lock clicked open easily, and I pulled the door upward, letting daylight spill into the small space. No antiques, no jewelry boxes. Instead, cardboard boxes labeled in her handwriting, photo albums, recipe cards, journals, and a quilt I remembered. I sat on an overturned crate and opened the first box. Inside were photographs I'd never seen. My grandmother as a young woman beside a lake with someone I didn't recognize. Letters bundled with ribbon, postcards from places she never talked about visiting. Her life had been so much larger than the version I knew. She had kept it quietly folded away for decades, and now she had handed these fragments to me, trusting I would understand why they mattered more than anything with a price tag. One journal caught my attention. The cover worn soft from years of handling. Entries dated back 40 years in her careful script. She wrote about her marriage, her doubts, the children she raised, and the one she lost before my mother was born. That detail stopped me cold. I had never known about a lost child. She had carried that grief silently her entire life, and now she had handed it to me across, believing I would hold it gently and without judgment. I stayed until the light turned gold, then orange. Each box revealed another layer of the woman I thought I knew. By the end, I understood why she hadn't left these things to Richard. He would have donated them without a second glance, cleared out the space for something practical. But she knew I would sit exactly as I was, reading every word, honoring every memory. That knowledge settled into me like a homecoming, unexpected and deeply earned through nothing but her faith. Driving home that evening, I thought about Richard's accusation that I never showed up. He wasn't technically wrong, but showing up isn't always about being present in a room. Sometimes it's about being present in someone's heart, even when distance makes visits impossible. My grandmother had understood that difference and made sure I knew it too. Her letter wasn't just an inheritance. It was permission to forgive myself for the years I'd stayed away, believing I'd failed her. I didn't call Richard that night or any night after. There was nothing to explain to him, nothing he would accept. Instead, I started reading through her journals slowly, one entry at a time, letting her voice return through the pages. She wrote about ordinary days with extraordinary, the way morning light hit her kitchen, the smell of rain on dry earth. She noticed everything, recorded everything, and now those observations belonged. 3 weeks into reading, I found an entry about me. She described a summer afternoon when I was 8, sitting beside her while she gardened. She wrote that I had asked her if people disappeared completely when they died, or if something stayed behind. She said my question haunted her beautifully for years. I had no memory of asking it, but somehow she had carried my childhood wondering into her old age, turning it over like a stone. Her answer was in the next entry. She wrote that she believed pieces of ourselves in the people who truly see us. Not memories exactly, but something more like rhythm. The way we laugh, the phrases we repeat, the small habits that outlive our bodies. She said she hoped I would carry her rhythm forward, not because I had to, but because I was the only one who ever really listened when she spoke. I brought the quilt to my apartment and draped it over the chair by my window. Every morning now, I see it when I wake up. The fabric is faded in places, worn thin where her hands must have rested. It smells faintly of cedar and something else I can't name. Her house, maybe? Or just time itself pressed into thread. I run my fingers across the stitches sometimes, imagining her working by lamplight, never knowing this would become my most treasured possession. Richard called once, weeks later, asking if there was anything valuable in that storage unit. I told him there wasn't. Not valuable to him anyway. He made a frustrated sound and hung up without saying goodbye. I understood then that we would probably never speak again, and that felt less like loss than like clarity. Some family bonds are blood, others are choice. My grandmother had chosen me, and that mattered more than shared holidays ever could. I'm still learning what to do with the trust she placed in me. Some days, it feels like a gift. Other days, like a responsibility I'm not sure I deserve. But I carry it forward, trying to become the person she believed I already was. Her journals sit on my shelf now, waiting for the evenings when I need her voice again. She's gone, but she left herself behind. In rhythm, in words, in the quiet faith that someone would finally listen. A month after the reading, my mother called. She had heard about the storage unit from Richard, who apparently couldn't resist complaining to anyone who would listen. Her voice carried that familiar tension, not anger exactly, but something bruised underneath. She asked why Grandma had given those things to me instead of her. I didn't have a good answer. The truth was, I had been wondering the same thing, turning the question over late at night without resolution. Mom drove down that weekend, something she rarely did. She stood in my apartment doorway looking smaller than I remembered, her coat buttoned wrong, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on the quilt draped over my chair. She crossed toward it without speaking and ran her fingers along the... I watched her face change, softening first, then tightening into something I couldn't. She asked if she could sit down, and her voice cracked slightly. We sat together near the window, the quilt between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. She told me she recognized it from her childhood bedroom, back when her mother made quilts for everyone in the family. Hers had been lost in a move decades ago, and she assumed they were all gone. Finding this one here in my apartment opened something old inside her. I could see it happening in real time, grief mixing with surprise, mixing with something close to jealousy. I offered to share the journals with her, thinking it might help. But when I handed her the first one, she held it without opening it. She said she wasn't sure she wanted to know what her mother had written privately. There might be things in there about her, about their difficult years, about the distance that had grown between them after my grandfather died. I understood her hesitation. Some doors, once opened, changed the shape of every room behind them forever. She stayed for dinner, and we talked about safer things, her garden, my job, a neighbor's new dog. But the journals sat on the table between us, impossible to ignore. Before she left, she asked me one question that stayed with me for days. She wanted to know if Grandma had written anything about being proud of her. I said I hadn't gotten that far yet, which was true. But I also saw how much the answer mattered, and it made my chest ache. After she drove home, I returned to the journals with different eyes. I wasn't just reading for myself anymore. I was reading for my mother too, searching for the words she needed to hear even if she couldn't bring herself to look. I found entries about their arguments, yes, sharp paragraphs filled with frustration and misunderstanding. But I also found something else underneath, something my grandmother had never managed to say directly to her daughter's face. She wrote about watching my mother grow up, how fierce and independent she had been even as a child. She described feeling proud and terrified in equal measure, worried that such a strong spirit would eventually outgrow the need for a mother altogether. The fear had made her pull back, protect herself from rejection by creating distance first. Reading it, I recognized the pattern immediately. My mother had done the same thing to me during my teenage years, and I had repeated it too. 3 generations of women, all building walls out of the same fear, being left behind by the people we loved most. My grandmother had seen it clearly enough to write it down, but not clearly enough to break the cycle while she was alive. Now that work fell to me, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough. I closed the journal that night, feeling the weight of inheritance in a completely different way. Some legacies are heavier than houses or money. I called my mother the next morning and read her the entry over the phone. She was silent for a long time after I finished. I could hear her breathing, uneven and shaky, and I knew she was crying without needing to see her face. When she finally spoke, she thanked me in a whisper. She said she had waited 50 years to hear those words, and she never thought they would come. The conversation changed something between us, though I couldn't name it yet. The following week, I found an entry that mentioned a cabin by a lake, somewhere my grandmother had gone as a young woman, before marriage, before children, before the life that eventually shaped her. She wrote about it with such longing that I could feel the ache through the page. The lake was where she had felt most herself, most free. She returned there once after my grandfather died, but never again. The drive had become too long, her body too tired. She had written the address in the margin, almost like an afterthought. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if the place still existed. Something pulled at me. Not curiosity exactly, but a kind of obligation. She had trusted me with her private world, and this cabin was part of it. I wanted to see what she had seen, stand where she had stood, understand why this particular place had stayed with her across an entire lifetime of change. I took 3 days off work and drove north without telling it. The route wound through small towns I had never heard of, past farms and fields just beginning to turn green with early spring. My grandmother had made the same drive decades ago, probably on these same roads, watching the same hills rise and fall outside her window. I imagined her younger, hopeful, not yet shaped by the disappointments that would come later. The thought made her feel closer somehow, more real. The cabin was still there, though barely. The roof sagged in the middle and the porch steps had rotted through in places. A for sale sign leaned against the fence, weathered and faded, probably years old. I parked on the gravel road and just sat for a while looking. This was where she had been happiest, and now it was falling apart. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, but it didn't feel sad exactly. It felt honest, the way all endings eventually feel if you wait long enough. I walked down to the lake, picking my way through overgrown grass and wildflowers. The water was calm, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. I sat on a flat rock near the shore and tried to imagine her here, young, unburdened, full of possibilities she couldn't yet name. She had written about swimming out to the middle and floating on her back, staring up at the sky until she forgot where her body ended and the water began. I wanted that feeling too, though the air was still too cold. I took photographs to show my mother later, the cabin, the lake, the view from the rock where I sat. I wanted her to see this place, even if she never came herself. Maybe understanding where her mother had been happiest would help her understand other things too. Or maybe it wouldn't change anything at all. Either way, I felt like I was completing something my grandmother had started, carrying her memory forward into spaces she could no longer reach. On the drive home, I thought about what it means to inherit someone's inner life. The storage unit had contained objects, but the journals contained something harder to hold: her fears, her regrets, her small joys, and large disappointments. She had given me access to parts of herself that even my mother had never seen. That was a tremendous gift, but also a tremendous responsibility. I was now the keeper of a woman who no longer existed anywhere except in my memory and attention. I got home late that night and called my mother again. I described the cabin, the lake, the feeling of standing where Grandma had once been young. She listened quietly, asking small questions. What color was the water? Were there birds? Did the cabin still have its original windows? I answered as best I could, and somewhere in the middle of our conversation, I realized we were doing something new. We were talking without walls, without the protective distance that had always defined us. She asked if I would take her there someday when the weather warmed up. I said yes without hesitating. We could make the drive together, maybe pack a lunch, maybe stay overnight in one of those small towns along the way. The idea of sharing that experience with her felt right in a way I couldn't fully explain. My grandmother had left me her secrets, but maybe the real inheritance was simpler, a reason for my mother and me to finally find our way back to each other. The journals are still on my shelf, waiting for the evenings when I need her voice. But I read them differently now, not just as private confessions, but as instructions. She was teaching me how to see, how to notice the small moments before they disappear. She was showing me that love doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides in margins, in addresses scribbled as afterthoughts, in quilts folded away for decades until the right person finally unfolds them again. I called the number on the for sale sign the next day. The woman who answered sounded surprised anyone was interested. She said the property had been on the market for years, the price dropping lower each season. I asked how much they were asking now, and when she told me, I felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't impossible. It wasn't even unreasonable. My grandmother had given me more than memories. She had given me a direction. And for the first time in years, I knew exactly where I wanted to go. I didn't tell my mother about the phone call right away. I needed to sit with the idea first, let it settle into something real before speaking it out loud. Buying the cabin felt impulsive and completely right at the same time, two feelings I had never experienced together before. My grandmother had left me enough in a separate account, one Mr. Harrison mentioned quietly after Richard stormed out. She had planned this, I realized. She had been planning it for years. The paperwork took 3 weeks. I signed documents in the same law office where everything had started, Mr. Harrison watching me with something like approval in his eyes. He said my grandmother had spoken about the cabin once, years ago, when she updated her will. She told him it was the only place she ever felt like herself, and she hoped someday someone in the family would understand why. He didn't know then what she meant. Now, watching me sign, he said he finally did. I drove to my mother's house on a Saturday morning with the deed in my bag. She was in her garden when I arrived, kneeling in the dirt with her hands buried in soil. I stood at the edge of the lawn and watched her work for a moment before she noticed me. When she looked up, her face shifted through surprise, then worry, then something softer. She asked what was wrong, assuming bad news. I told her nothing was wrong. Something was finally right. We sat on her porch with glasses of iced tea while I explained everything: the phone call, the price, the separate account my grandmother had left specifically for. My mother listened without interrupting, her fingers wrapped tight around her glass. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked why I hadn't told her sooner. I admitted I was afraid she would think I was being foolish, spending money on a falling-apart cabin hours away from everything practical. She shook her head slowly and said it wasn't foolish at all. She said her mother had talked about that lake her entire childhood, describing it like a place from a fairy tale. She had always wanted to see it but never asked to go. There was too much distance between them by then, too many unspoken hurts piled up like stones. Hearing that her mother's dream place now belonged to someone in the family, it meant something to her she couldn't quite articulate. We made plans to visit together the following weekend. I spent the days between preparing, buying cleaning supplies, packing old blankets, researching contractors who worked in that rural area. The cabin needed significant repairs before anyone could stay overnight safely. But the bones were good, the woman on the phone had assured me. The foundation was solid, the walls were sound. Everything else was just surface damage, fixable with time and attention and resources I now unexpectedly had. The drive north with my mother was unlike any trip we had taken before. Usually our car rides were filled with safe topics and long silences, both of us afraid to venture into territory that might spark old arguments. But something had shifted. She asked about my life, really asked, with genuine curiosity, and I found myself answering honestly. I told her about my loneliness, my failed relationships, my fear that I had inherited the family talent for building walls instead of bridges. She told me about her own regrets too, things she had never shared before. She described the years after her father died, how her mother had retreated into grief so completely that she felt like an orphan despite having a living parent. She learned to stop reaching out because the rejection hurt too much. By the time her mother emerged from mourning, they had forgotten how to be close. The pattern had calcified into something neither of them knew how to break. We arrived at the cabin in late afternoon, the light turning golden through the trees. My mother stepped out of the car and stood very still, looking at the sagging roof and overgrown yard. I watched her face, trying to read what she was feeling. Then she smiled, a real smile, not the polite version she usually wore, and said it was exactly how she had pictured it. She could see why her mother loved this place. It felt like stepping outside of time. We walked down to the lake together, following the same path I had taken alone weeks before. She moved slowly, taking in the wildflowers, the birdsong, the way the water caught the fading light. When we reached the shore, she sat on the same flat rock and looked out at the water without speaking. I sat beside her, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. The silence between us felt different now. It felt chosen instead of defensive. She told me about a memory that had surfaced during the drive, a summer afternoon when she was very young, before the distance grew. before everything became complicated. Her mother had taken her to a lake somewhere, maybe this one, and they had waded into the shallow water together holding hands. She had forgotten that day completely until now. Being here had unlocked something she thought was lost forever, and she thanked me quietly for bringing her back. We spent the weekend cleaning what we could and making lists of what needed professional help. My mother threw herself into the work with surprising energy, scrubbing windows and sweeping floors and pulling weeds from the overgrown garden beds. I watched her transform as the hours passed, her shoulders relaxing, her movements becoming freer, her laughter coming easier. This place was healing something in her too, something older than our own complicated history. On the last evening, we built a small fire in the old stone pit behind the cabin. The flames crackled and sparked while the sky darkened above us. My mother pulled out a journal I hadn't seen before, one she had taken from my apartment with my permission. Wanting to read her mother's words for herself finally, she had found an entry that morning and asked if she could read it to me. Her voice shook slightly as she began. My grandmother had written about the day my mother was born, the fear and joy and overwhelming love that had flooded through her in the hospital room. She described holding this tiny, fierce creature and knowing immediately that she would never be the same. She wrote that motherhood had broken her open in ways she didn't know how to repair. The love was so big it terrified her, and she spent years trying to protect herself from its full weight. My mother stopped reading and wiped her eye. She said she finally understood something she had spent her whole life misinterpreting. Her mother's distance wasn't rejection, it was fear, disguised as self-protection. The love had always been there underneath, too large and too frightening to express directly. Hearing those words from decades ago, in her mother's own handwriting, released something that had been locked tight inside her for 50 years. We sat by the fire until the embers died down, talking about everything and nothing. She asked what I planned to do with the cabin, and I told her I wasn't entirely sure yet. Maybe fix it up slowly, visit on weekends, eventually make it livable again? Or maybe something else would reveal itself in time. I had learned from my grandmother's journals that some answers only come when you stop demanding them and simply remain present. Before we left the next morning, I walked through the cabin one more time, touching the walls and window frames like I was making a promise. This place had waited decades for someone to return and care for it again. My grandmother couldn't come back herself, but she had found a way to send me in her place. The inheritance wasn't just property or money. It was a mission to restore what time had neglected and remember what others had forgotten. The drive home was quieter, but not uncomfortable. My mother fell asleep somewhere past the halfway point, her head resting against the window, her face peaceful in a way I rarely saw. I thought about the women who came before me, my grandmother, my mother, all the love and fear and miscommunication that had shaped our family across. I was holding all of it now, and I was choosing to do something different with it. Richard called a few weeks later, having heard through someone that I bought the cabin. His voice carried disbelief and irritation in equal measure. He asked what I could possibly want with a falling-apart shack in the middle of nowhere. I told him it wasn't about wanting, it was about understanding. He went silent for a moment, then said I was just like her, meaning my grandmother. This time, I took it as the compliment he never intended it to be. The cabin is still a work in progress, months later. The roof is fixed, the porch is rebuilt, and the inside is slowly becoming livable again. My mother visits often, helping with small projects, reading journals by the lake, learning to know her mother through words left behind. We are building something new in that old place, not just walls and floors, but a relationship finally freed from the patterns that once held us prisoner. My grandmother made this possible. All I had to do was listen. By autumn, the cabin had become my refuge. I drove up every other weekend, sometimes alone, sometimes with my mother. The leaves turned brilliant shades of orange and gold around the lake, and I understood why my grandmother had written about this season most often in her journals. She described October here as her favorite month, the air sharp and clean, the water reflecting colors so vivid they almost hurt. Now, I was seeing it exactly as she had. I brought the last box from the storage unit on a Friday evening, the one I had been avoiding since spring. It sat heavier than the others, sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with. My grandmother had labeled it simply before, in her careful. I didn't know what that meant until I opened it alone in the cabin's small living room. The fire crackling beside me, the lake visible through windows I had cleaned myself months ago. Inside were photographs from her life before marriage, dozens of them, loose and unsorted, capturing a woman I barely recognized. She was laughing in most of them, her head thrown back, her eyes bright with something I had never seen in the grandmother I knew. There were pictures of friends whose names I would never learn, parties in cramped apartments, road trips with suitcases strapped to car roofs. She had lived so fully once, before responsibility reshaped her into someone quieter. The photograph from the lake was there too, the one I had found in the first box, showing her beside someone I didn't recognize. Now there were more pictures of him, this tall man with kind eyes and an easy smile. They stood close in every shot, their bodies angled toward each other like plants leaning toward sun. On the back of one photo, she had written 2 words in pencil, faded but still legible: Daniel, always. I searched the journals that night with new purpose, looking for any mention of this name. I found him in entries from 60 years ago, pages filled with a kind of longing I had never associated with my practical, reserved grandmother. Daniel had been her first love, the man she met during a summer at this very lake. They had planned a life together, marriage, children, a home nearby. Then something happened that she never fully explained, and he was gone from the pages entirely. The gap in the journals lasted almost a year. When she started writing again, she was engaged to my grandfather, a man she described with respect, but never passion. She wrote about duty, about expectations, about the life she was supposed to want. Reading between the lines, I understood that she had chosen security over love, practicality over risk. It was a decision that haunted her quietly for decades, even as she built a family and a home and everything that looked like happiness from the outside. I called my mother the next morning and told her about Dan. She was silent for a long moment, then admitted she had always suspected something. Her parents' marriage had been stable but distant, functional but never warm. She remembered wondering as a child why her mother sometimes stared out windows with an expression that looked like homesickness. Now she understood what her mother had been missing. Not a place, but a person she had let go before my mother was ever born. We decided to search for information together, curious about what had happened to this man who had meant so much. My mother drove up that weekend with her laptop and a determination I had rarely seen in her. We sat at the small kitchen table I had refinished myself, searching databases and old records, piecing together fragments of a story my grandmother had kept hidden for over half a century. The search felt intrusive at first, then necessary. We found him in an obituary from 12 years ago. Daniel Hartman, beloved husband and father, passed peacefully at 79. He had lived 3 hours away his entire adult life, close enough that their paths could have crossed, but apparently never did. He had married someone else, raised children, built his own version of the life they had once planned together. The obituary mentioned his love of lakes and fishing, small details that felt like echoes of the young man in those photographs. My mother read the obituary twice, then closed the laptop gently. She said it was strange to grieve someone she had never met, but that was exactly what she felt. This man had shaped her mother in ways that rippled through generations, affecting a family he never knew existed. If things had been different, my mother wouldn't exist. I wouldn't exist. The cabin would belong to strangers. Our entire lives were built on a choice my grandmother made in heartbreak decades before any of us were born. I found one more entry about Daniel, buried near the end of a journal from 15 years ago. My grandmother had written it after attending a funeral for an old friend, someone who had known them both during that summer at the lake. The funeral had brought everything back: the love, the loss, the life she had traded for stability. She wrote that she didn't regret her choice, not exactly, but she had never stopped wondering what might have been, and she hoped that was allowed. The entry ended with a line that made me catch my breath. She wrote that she hopes someone would find these journals someday and understand that a person can hold two truths at once, loving the life you built while mourning the life you didn't. She wanted whoever read her words to know that regret and gratitude can coexist, that choosing one path doesn't mean the other path was wrong. It just means you're human, doing your best with the information you had at the time. I shared that passage with my mother, and she cried openly in a way I had never witnessed before. She said her mother had given her a gift she didn't know she needed: permission to stop being perfect, to acknowledge her own what-ifs without shame. She had spent years regretting decisions, carrying them like stones in her pocket. Hearing that her mother had done the same thing made her feel less alone in her own private disappointment. We scattered some of my grandmother's ashes by the lake that afternoon. I had kept a small portion separate from the official burial, sensing that she would have wanted part of herself to return here. My mother held my hand as we walked to the water's edge, the October wind sharp against our faces. We didn't say anything ceremonial, just opened the container and let the breeze carry her toward the water she had loved since she was young and fearless and full of impossible hope. The cabin felt different after that, lighter somehow. I hung the photograph of my grandmother and Daniel on the wall near the fireplace. Two young people frozen in a summer that ended too soon. Visitors might wonder who they were, and I would tell them the truth, that love doesn't always lead where you expect, but it leaves marks that matter anyway. My grandmother had taught me that through her silence and her words, her presence and her absence, her careful plans and her hidden grief. Winter came early that year, and I drove up one last time before the roads became dangerous. The lake had started to freeze at the edges, thin ice creeping outward from the shore. I walked the property slowly, checking that everything was secure for the cold months ahead. The cabin felt ready to sleep, patient and sturdy, waiting for spring to bring me back again. I locked the door with a promise to return as soon as the world thawed. My mother and I spent Christmas together for the first time in years at her house instead of through awkward phone calls. She had framed a photograph of her mother as a young woman, the laughing version I had discovered in the box marked before. It hung in her living room now, a reminder that the people we think we know always contain hidden depths. We toasted my grandmother that evening, thanking her for the chaos and clarity she had delivered into our carefully defended lives. Richard sent a card, surprisingly. Just a simple holiday greeting with his signature, no personal note. I didn't know what to make of it and decided not to analyze the gesture too deeply. People change or they don't, and either way, it wasn't my responsibility to interpret his motivations. My grandmother had known who he was and had made her choices accordingly. I trusted her judgment then, and I trusted it now, letting his card sit unopened on my counter until I eventually recycled it without guilt. Spring arrived slowly, then all at once. I returned to the cabin in April when the ice had melted and the first wildflowers were pushing through the soil. Everything looked exactly as I had left it, preserved through the long winter, ready to be lived in again. I opened all the windows to let fresh air move through the room, and I swore I caught the faintest trace of cedar and something else. Her presence, maybe, or just my imagination honoring her memory. The journals are finished now, every entry read and understood as best I can. I keep them in a cedar chest by the fireplace, protected but accessible, ready for whenever I need her voice again. My mother visits often, and sometimes we read passages aloud to each other, finding new meanings in words we've encountered before. My grandmother left us more than property or money. She left us a map back to, and we're still following it, one careful step at a time, grateful for the path she drew. A year had passed since that day in the lawyer's office when Richard laughed and an envelope changed everything. I marked the anniversary alone at the cabin, sitting on the porch I had rebuilt with my own hands, watching the morning light move across the lake. My grandmother had been gone now for 15 months, but she felt closer than ever. Her presence lived in every repaired floorboard, every planted flower, every journal entry I had memorized without meaning to. The cabin was fully restored now, transformed from a sagging relic into something warm and alive. I had kept everything simple: fresh white paint, sturdy furniture, curtains my mother had sewn from fabric we chose together. Nothing fancy or expensive, just honest and functional, the way my grandmother would have wanted. Visitors often commented on how peaceful it felt, and I always smiled without explaining. The peace wasn't accidental. It was inherited, passed down through intention and love. My mother arrived that afternoon with a small suitcase and news she had been holding back. She looked different, lighter somehow, younger, despite another year passing. Over tea at the kitchen table, she told me she had started writing her own journal. Not every day, just when something felt important enough to capture. She wanted her thoughts preserved the way her mother's had been, wanted to leave something behind for me to find someday. The idea moved me more than I expected. Our family had spent generations hiding from each other, building walls out of fear and silence. Now, my mother was choosing trut, deliberately creating a record of her inner life for me to inherit. She said my grandmother had taught her this, even from the grave. Some lessons arrive late, she explained, but they arrive exactly when you're ready to receive. She hadn't been ready before. She was ready now. We spent the weekend doing ordinary things, cooking together, walking the shoreline, reading on the porch while the rain came down soft and steady. I noticed how easily we moved around each other now, how natural our silences had become. The awkwardness that once defined our relationship had dissolved so gradually, I couldn't pinpoint when it disappeared. We had simply practiced being together until it stopped like practice and started feeling like. On Saturday evening, she handed me a small wrapped package she had brought from home. Inside was a ring I didn't recognize. Simple gold band, slightly worn, clearly old. She explained if it belonged to her mother, worn every day for decades, removed only at the very end when her fingers had grown too thin. The hospital had returned it with her other belongings, and my mother had kept it safe, waiting for the right moment to pass it forward. I slipped it onto my finger, and it fit perfectly. My mother laughed at the coincidence, then caught herself and said maybe it wasn't coincidence at all. Maybe my grandmother had known somehow that this ring would find its way to me eventually. The thought wasn't rational, but it felt true anyway. I had stopped requiring rational explanations for everything. Some things just were, and that was enough. We talked about Daniel that night, the man my grandmother had loved and lost before choosing the safer path. My mother had done more research on her own, finding distant relatives willing to share stories. Daniel had spoken about my grandmother once, late in his life, telling his daughter about a summer love that had shaped him forever. He said he understood why she chose differently, and he had never. He only hoped she found happiness in the life she built without. Hearing that brought a strange kind of closure. My grandmother's choice had caused pain, yes, to herself, to Daniel, to the family that might have been. But it had also made possible everything that came after, including me sitting here in a cabin by a lake with my mother beside me. The math of regret doesn't balance neatly. You lose some things to gain others, and you never know which column will weigh more until you reach the end and look back. I visited Mr. Harrison one last time before the anniversary, just to thank him for everything he had done. He seemed surprised to see me, but welcomed me warmly into his office. I told him about the cabin, the restoration, the relationship with my mother that had bloomed from such unexpected soil. He listened with that quiet attention lawyers develop over decades of practice. Then said something I would carry with me for years. He said my grandmother had worried about me specifically, had mentioned me by name when updating her will. She feared I was drifting through life without an anchor, too afraid of connection to build anything lasting. She hoped the inheritance would give me roots, not just property, but purpose. She wanted me to have something worth protecting, something that would teach me how to stay. He said she would be proud of what I had done with her gift. I cried in his office, which embarrassed me until he handed me a tissue and said it happened more often than I might think. Inheritance does strange things to people, he explained. Sometimes it brings out the worst greed and entitlement and family fractures that never heal. But sometimes, rarely, it brings out something better. He said he had watched my family closely over the past year, and he was grateful to have witnessed the better version for once. Richard never contested the will, despite his early threats. I heard through distant relatives that he had moved on, focused on other pursuits, stopped mentioning my grandmother's estate entirely. I didn't know if he had found peace or simply found distraction, and I realized it didn't matter to me anymore. His journey was his own, shaped by choices I couldn't influence. My grandmother had seen him clearly and distributed her legacy accordingly. That clarity was another gift she left behind. Summer returned to the lake, my second summer as the cabin's keeper. I hosted my mother for a full week this time, and we fell into a rhythm that felt ancient and new simultaneously. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon swims in water, still cold enough to make us gasp, evening conversations that wandered through decades of shared and separate. She told me stories about my grandmother I had never heard, filling in gaps the journals had left empty. One afternoon, she asked what I planned to do with the cabin eventually. Keep it forever, pass it down, sell it if circumstances change. I admitted I had been thinking about that question more lately. The honest answer was that I didn't know yet, but I was learning to trust uncertainty, to let answers emerge instead of forcing them. My grandmother had spent decades carrying questions she never resolved, and she still managed to build a meaningful life. Uncertainty wasn't failure. It was just life, unfinished. My mother said she had a suggestion, if I was open to hearing it. She proposed that we make this place a family tradition, something passed down intentionally through generations with clear purpose. Not just property, but practice. A commitment to gathering here, reconnecting here, remembering here. She wanted the cabin to outlive both of us, wanted her future grandchildren to know this lake the way her mother had, the way we were learning to know it together now. The idea felt right immediately, like a key sliding into a lock I didn't know existed. I agreed without hesitation, and we spent the rest of the afternoon drafting informal plans, nothing legal yet, just dreams on paper, possibilities sketched in pencil that could be erased and redrawn as needed. We were building something larger than ourselves, a structure made of intention and memory rather than wood and stone. Before she left at the end of the week, my mother stood on the porch and looked out at the lake for a long time. She said she finally understood why her mother had loved this place so fiercely, why she had kept it secret like something precious and fragile. Some things are too important to share carelessly. They need protection until the right person comes along, someone who will honor them properly. My grandmother had waited her whole life for that person. She had chosen me. I drove home alone as the sun set behind me, the cabin growing smaller in my rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. But I knew exactly where it was, exactly what it meant, exactly why it mattered. My grandmother had given me more than property or money or even answers. She had given me a direction, a purpose, a place in a story larger than my own small life. All I had to do was keep showing up, keep listening, keep honoring what she left behind. The ring still fits perfectly on my finger, warm against my skin as I write this. The journals wait on my shelf at home, patient and full, ready whenever I need her voice again. And somewhere, in a cabin by a lake, a photograph hangs near a fireplace. Two young people frozen in a summer of impossible hope, reminding everyone who sees it that love leaves marks, whether it lasts. My grandmother taught me that. Now, I carry it forward, one careful step at a time, into whatever comes next.